Frank Colby never asked for attention. He earned his silence through decades of service. But on that morning, silence was no longer enough. At 75, retired Sergeant Major Frank Colby walked into the polished, modern space of Provisions and Company for a simple cup of coffee. Wearing his well-worn tweed jacket and a small ribbon bar on the inside lapel, medals earned from years in combat, he quietly asked for the advertised veterans discount. Presenting his VAI, the young clerk behind the counter, Kevin, barely looked up. Instead, he exclaimed, humiliated. Frank took his overpriced coffee and sat outside, heart pounding, not from the caffeine but from the sting of public disrespect. The ribbons he wore weren't decorations. They were stories of sacrifice, pain, and pride. And for the first time in years, he dialed a number he'd kept saved. General Alistair Reed, his former commanding officer. 10 minutes later, everything changed. The cafe's cheerful background music suddenly stopped. General Maisedi's voice rang over the intercom, sharp and commanding. He publicly condemned the disrespect towards a decorated veteran and ordered the store closed for the day. Mandatory staff training followed, along with a public apology and a charitable donation made in Frank's name. That day, Frank's quiet courage reminded everyone listening. Respect is not optional, and for those who've served, it must never be forgotten. Frank Colby Howe. Hey, Frank simply wanted a hot coffee and, as advertised, a veteran's discount. He politely presented his VAID to the young cashier, Kevin, who was barely shaken. Frank paid the full price without argument and made his way to a patio bench outside. He didn't drink the coffee. It had already turned bitter. He reached into his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in years, General Alistair Reed, his former commanding officer. Reed listened in silence, his voice cold and clipped when Frank finished. "Stay where you are," the general said. "I'll be there in 10. 10 minutes later, the entire store fell silent as the music cut off. Over the loudspeaker came the unmistakable voice of General Reid, publicly addressing the staff and customers. His message was swift and unyielding. Disrespecting a decorated veteran was unacceptable. He called out the actions of Kevin and Miss Albright by name. Reed ordered the store closed for the day, announced a mandatory training session on veteran respect, and pledged a large donation in Frank's name to a national veterans organization. Kevin stood pale and shaken. Miss Albright stumbled over apologies. Frank, stunned but grateful, stood beside his old commander once more, not on a battlefield, but on the moral high ground. That day, in a coffee shop filled with whispers and shame, the world was reminded that medals are not decorations. They are sacred symbols of sacrifice. And when that sacrifice is mocked, justice can still march in, sometimes wearing a suit instead of a uniform. Frank Colby had never sought attention. A man shaped by years of military discipline and quiet sacrifice, he had always believed dignity, it need applause. But as he sat on the metal bench outside Provisions and Company, the sting of humiliation was still fresh from his encounter with a Kevin, the young cashier who mocked his medals. Something stirred within him. The clerk's words, costume jewelry, gumball machine trinkets, echoed louder than any battlefield explosion. Frank had fought too long, bled too deeply, and lost too many friends to let that moment pass unanswered. So he made a call, not to customer service, not to the store manager, but to a number tucked deep in his phone book. A number given to him long ago by General Alistair Reed with just 5 words. Call me if, to Frank's surprise, the general didn't send someone else. He came himself. Within 10 minutes, the store's ambient music cut out, replaced by the unmistakable voice of a man who had led troops into battle and now stood ready to defend a comrade once more. Inside Provisions or the casual air shifted. Customers froze mid-step. Clerks stood still, wide-eyed. And Kevin, who had been boasting moments earlier about putting an old faker in his place, looked as though he'd seen a ghost. Over the store's loudspeaker, General Reed's voice rang clear and unwavering. He speaks not just of Frank Colby, but of every veteran whose sacrifices too often go unrecognized. A man who served this country with valor, he said, who earned a Silver Star and a Purple Heart, mocked publicly, disrespected. Not on my watch. Then came the reckoning. General Reed had emerged from the back office and walked directly to the manager, Miss Albright and Kevin. What followed was not a lecture, but a correction, a realignment of values. Apologies were demanded and given. The store was ordered closed for the day. A mandatory training on veteran respect was imposed. A sizable donation to the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans was pledged in Frank's name, all under the stern, commanding presence of a leader who refused to let disrespect stand unchallenged. Frank didn't say much. He didn't need to. As he stood beside the general, upright despite the cane and old injuries, the message was already clear. Sometimes battles don't take place on foreign soil. They happen in everyday places, like coffee counters and grocery aisles. And sometimes the fight isn't for territory, but for respect. That day, Frank Colby walked away not just with vindication, but with the comforting knowledge that true honor still has defenders, and that when one veteran is disrespected, it's never just his fight alone. Frank Colby had seen war, endured hardship, and served his country for over 3 decades. But nothing quite prepared him for the casual sting of disrespect served up by a boy half his age in a coffee shop that claimed to honor veterans. That morning, Frank had forgotten in his selectively Kevin, the young clerk behind the counter, had sneezed at Frank's service medals, calling them costume jewelry and mocking the very essence of his military life. When Frank quietly showed his VA ID and asked for the advertised discount, Kevin dismissed him with an air of arrogance and ignorance, admitting to acknowledge the legitimacy of either the ID or the ribbons. Other shoppers frequently but said nothing. Even Miss Albright, the manager, touched over the scene and looked away. Frank left the counter with his pride bruised more than his wallet. The bitterness of that coffee he never sipped lingering long after. But Frank wasn't entirely alone. Sitting on a bench just outside, with his medals still pinned close to his chest, he reached for a number he hadn't dialed in years, a direct line to General Alistair Reed. The two had served together, and Reed had once told him, "If you ever need me, day or night, call." 10 minutes later, the entire store fell silent as the cheerful music cut off and a commanding voice came through the speaker system. General Reed didn't raise his voice, but every word struck with purpose. He publicly condemned the behavior toward Frank, naming names and calling out the store's leadership for their failure of respect, empathy, and professionalism. The store was stunned. Kevin stood frozen. Miss Albright rushed out, horrified. Reed entered with quiet authority, made eye contact with everyone, and demanded a public apology, not just from Kevin, but from the manager too. He went further. The store would close for the day for mandatory training, and a sizable donation would be made to a veterans organization in Frank's name. He didn't just demand respect, he taught it. Later, the general took Frank to a nearby cafe, bought him lunch, and talked about old times. He assured Frank that his sacrifice had not been forgotten and that no soldier, retired or active, would ever stand alone while he had a voice to speak. That day, the city didn't just witness a reprimand. It saw a powerful reminder that medals are not decorations. They are silent testimonies of duty, pain, and courage. And for veterans like Frank Colby, even a single voice of honor can drown out 1,000. The air inside the store was still tense, thick with the weight of what had just occurred. Shoppers stood frozen, and staff members shifted uncomfortably as General Alistair Reed turned toward the store manager and clerk with a commanding presence that left no room for rebuttal. "Miss Albright," he began, his tone firm but controlled, "and you, young man," he turned sharply to Kevin, "you will both now offer Sergeant Major Frank Colby a direct, public, and heartfelt apology." Kevin's face, pale and clammy, twitched as he struggled to meet the general's eyes. His earlier arrogance had vanished. I'm so sorry, Sergeant Major," he stammered, voice cracking. "I didn't realize." Miss Albright stepped forward quickly, her voice more practiced but no less rattled. "Mr. Colby, please accept my sincerest apologies for the behavior you endured in this store. It was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for the failure in judgment and oversight." Frank Colby, still holding his untouched coffee, nodded slowly. "Apology accepted," he said, quietly, though the pain in his eyes lingered. General Reed wasn't done. "Secondly," he continued, This store will make a substantial donation to the National Coalition for Homeless Veterans in Sergeant Major Colby's name. He paused for effect. A donation large enough to reflect both the gravity of the offense and this establishment's public claim of supporting veterans. Miss Albright blinked. Yes, General, of course. Third, the General added, this store will close immediately for the remainder of the day. Every employee will attend a mandatory emergency training session on respect, service, and veteran awareness. The trainers will be from my foundation, and you'll be reopening tomorrow with a renewed understanding of who your customers are and what some of them have sacrificed. The silence that followed was stunned. No one had ever seen a store shut down midday by a retired general. General Reed turned to Frank and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. Frank, you didn't deserve this. Not today, not ever. And while we can't undo what happened, we can ensure it doesn't happen again. Not in this store and, God willing, not anywhere else. He looked around the store, letting the silence do the rest of the talking. No shouting, no threats, just action and accountability. The fallout from the incident at Provisions and Company spread faster than anyone expected. Within hours, cell phone videos of General Alistair Reed's address over the store's intercom and his confrontation with Kevin and Miss Albright were circulating on social media. The clip showing Frank Colby standing silently next to the general, weathered and dignified, resonated with viewers across the country. Veterans groups, military families, and civilians alike began sharing the video with hashtags like @RespectOurVeterans and #FrankDeservesBetter. By morning, national news outlets had picked up the story. Interview requests flooded the store's corporate office. Public outrage was palpable. Many were appalled that a decorated veteran like Frank Colby, recipient of the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Valor, and Purple Heart, could be ridiculed so casually by someone half his age. The story became more than just about one man's mistreatment. It struck a nerve about how society was forgetting the sacrifices of its aging veterans. General Reed, a man of action and few words, held a brief press conference in front of the local VA hospital. He reiterated his disappointment in the store's initial failure and commended Frank for handling the situation with dignity. This isn't just about Sergeant Major Colby, he said firmly. It's about the quiet, daily respect owed to every man and woman who has worn the uniform, especially those who no longer have the strength to demand it themselves. Meanwhile, Frank found himself the unlikely face of a broader movement. Letters poured in from fellow veterans and strangers expressing support, many sharing their own stories of subtle humiliation or being forgotten. The National Coalition for Homeless Veterans announced that the donation made in Frank's name would fund a new outreach center in the city, complete with his portrait and a plaque honoring his service. Kevin, the clerk, was not fired at Frank's quiet request. Let him learn, Frank had told the general. Humility is a better teacher than unemployment. Instead, Kevin was assigned to assist with logistics at the new outreach center during its opening weeks. Miss Albright, shaken by the experience, implemented new training protocols for all staff and personally met with veterans groups to create a respectful, long-term partnership. For Frank, the days that followed were humbling. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him, and old comrades from his unit called for the first time in years. But what touched him most was a hand-drawn letter from a fifth grader who wrote, "Dear Mr. Frank, thank you for being brave. I hope you get free coffee forever." As Frank sipped his coffee on the same patio where it all began, this time warm and freely offered by the store with a smile, he smiled quietly to himself. He hadn't set out to start a movement, but sometimes a single voice backed by honor and a good friend in command could remind a whole city what respect really looked like. As 75-year-old veteran Frank Colby stood quietly at the corner of Elm and 3rd, clutching a folded American flag to his chest, he never imagined what would happen next. Participating in a peaceful remembrance walk, Frank was honoring his fallen brothers in arms when local police, mistaking his slow movements and weathered face for a potential disturbance, tackled him to the ground. The flag hit the pavement. So did the silence. What followed stunned the entire block. Within 6 minutes, a convoy of black SUVs rolled in, military grade, no sirens, just purpose. Out stepped General Alistair Reed, flanked by aides, his boots hitting on the pavement with a calm authority that turned heads and froze hearts. Without raising his voice, he ordered Frank's release, reprimanded the officers, and helped lift the old soldier from the sidewalk himself. "This man carried a nation's burden," he said quietly, "and today we failed to carry his." The entire block watched as the general saluted Frank, and in that moment, no one questioned who the real hero was. Respect is not a suggestion, it's a responsibility. In a world that moves fast, we often forget those who march slowly so we could run freely. Veterans like Frank Colby shouldn't have to demand dignity. They've already earned it. Let this story be a reminder. How we treat the most silent among us speaks louder than any parade or speech. If this story moved you, drop a comment below with the word honor. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us of what truly matters and the heroes walking quietly among us every day.